and a lot of new slides and things, so thank you for
You're welcome.
that. It's great. And so, questions, anybody? And Tracy, people watching, can they ask questions? So if they're watching live, is there a way to click on to ask question on the site? Is that what it is? Okay, so yeah, so it's questions at NDN. For those of you watching, NDN, questions at ndn.org. Send them in. Tracy will shepherd them over here. And also, just to do a plug, is that here's the book. You can buy it on Amazon. And
if you're online.
And if you're online, if you're here, you can buy and get an autograph copy.
There you go.
Here at the end of the event. So please stay with us. So have at it, everybody. Anybody got a question for Morley and Mike? Yes, ma'am.
Wait,
need a mic. And just to remind everybody is that this is being recorded for in perpetuity, digitally for all time. So don't be good and don't make any mistakes. That's all. Yep.
The pressure.
Yeah.
Morley, one of the things you'd said in your presentation was that you anticipated mandatory national service. And I have to say that I find that somewhat contradictive to what we're talking about here in terms of the distributed kind of network, the distributed kind of involvement. So could you explain to us what you mean by that and what you envision?
Sure, it's a great question. Because it's going to be, in our opinion, an characteristic of many, many different policies, not just service. So the beginnings of it will be what we see now, a great expansion of those who want to participate, incentives to do so, a lot of enthusiasm for it, et cetera. At some point, people are going to say, wait a minute, look at all of us doing all this. Where's everybody else? I mean, come on, group, let's get together. This is a very group-oriented generation. And they're not going to be very appreciative of attempts to free ride, that everybody else is fixing the country and you're not. And so there'll be a great deal of peer pressure to make that happen. What civic generations tend to look to from a centralized governmental effort is the rule setting. So the rule will be thou shalt do national service, in our opinion, at some point. And there will be rules about how to do it and incentives for doing it. But how to do it won't be set by the national government. So all the current service organizations that are official in the federal government, those that may be aligned with it, like Teach for America, will all get drawn into, we don't care how you do your national service. This is not the draft, but thou shalt do it. And when thou shalt do it, we will help you with your education. And so the difference, it's like healthcare mandates. We actually think that individual mandates will be part of the healthcare outcome, not only because it makes sense from a policy perspective in terms of insurance rules, but also because it's a way of setting the standards for behavior, what it means to be a citizen in a civic era in America. Thou shalt have health insurance. We're not going to tell you which one to have. You're going to have lots of choice on how you do it, but what you have to do will be very clear. And it rolls through environmental policy and a whole raft of things as we go forward. Mike, you wanted to comment?
The only comment is just to emphasize a point that Morley made, and that is that it is going to sort of offer choice. He said it's not going to be the draft. In previous civic eras, that's what it was. That's what national service was, essentially, in World War II. And every able-bodied male, and some who probably weren't so able-bodied, were drafted into the military. And so this will offer a variety of different choices. And secondly is the reward on the back end. It is not simply going to be, we're going to extract your labor, but you will be rewarded, as was the case in the World War II era with the GI Bill. We will see similar kinds of help in providing education, which in the long run not only benefits those people, but obviously benefits society as well, because it will allow things to get done, and we will have a better educated workforce on the back end of this, as again was the case in the 1940s and 50s.
So next question is from one of our viewers. It's from Frank Davies, who chickened out and didn't brave the rain, and is watching it from his computer, our good friend Frank. San Jose Mercury News. So Frank's question is for Morley and Mike. Organizing for America is trying to mobilize Obama supporters starting this weekend to become an important part of the campaign to enact the ambitious Obama budget. How hard will it be for millennials and others in Obama's online army to make the transition from campaigning to influencing policy? Will the energy unleashed in the election translate? How will the energy unleashed in the election translate to the messy business of getting legislation passed.
So this will be one of the other great institutional transformations that America will undergo. And the focus of the transformation in this case will be the legislative branch and not the executive branch. The legislative branch is about to experience crowdsourcing as legislative policy making, and we've never seen that before. Organizing for America is a phenomenon in itself in terms of this new era because it's an organized netroots program directed centrally from Washington about Washington events. Our prediction would be it won't be nearly as exciting as a campaign and therefore not have the levels of participation that Obama for America's Facebook page did in terms of mobilization. But compared to what existed before, which is zero, and the inability to do anything except artificial turf grassroots, this is going to be a considerable change. Simon and I have a little bit of historical baggage here, which we probably shouldn't talk about on video, but at the end of the 1992 campaign, the Clinton presidency faced the same question: what to do with the organization that had been put in place sort of over and separate from the political party. And the ultimate decision was to do nothing. And that was a very costly mistake by the president, as he learned in the next couple of years. This ability to communicate and organize and mobilize on behalf of a cause, now a budget or a legislative proposal, be it healthcare, global warming, education reform, tax cuts, whatever it is, that's a very powerful weapon. And we're going to see it first used in this coming debate. And like everything else, when it starts, it won't be as powerful as it will be. But it will be transformational. It will be, okay, I know what the lobbyist in my office just told me, but I also know that there are 3,000 people in my district who seem to be upset about this issue. I better pay attention to that as well as what the guy in my office just told me.
And I just wanted to, again, reemphasize that point, that if you look at it from the perspective of the member of Congress who is getting that input from his or her constituents, it will be, I think, quantumly larger than they are used to seeing it. And so while it may not be where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years, from their perspective, it may be a lobbyist, it may be some organized group within their district or state, and they may have gotten a couple hundred responses or letters or phone calls or something of that sort. The fact that they're going to be getting thousands is much more than they're used to receiving. So I think it is going to be viewed in a very different way than they have been used to seeing things. And the ability, going back to the campaign, of young people to actually become engaged in the political process through the internet is remarkable. Their willingness, for example, to watch Senator Obama's speech over and over again on race relations in reference to Preacher Wright was incredible and involved millions of young people willing to go online.
So, to Simon's point, it's not youth politics, it's adult politics.
It's adult
done by
politics,
young people.
By young people who
Right.
just happen to be a different young generation.
Yeah.
I'm Michael Nelson. I'm a professor of Internet Studies at Georgetown, and we study the impact of technology on society and how society is shaping technology. I'm particularly interested in the parts of your book where you look at the role of technology, and I'd be interested to hear a bit more about any analogies you can draw or differences you can draw between the Internet and this generation, the radio in the 1930s and newspapers in the 1860s. It seems to me that the Internet's been a much bigger factor here because it's used so differently by the different generations. The radio was something everybody listened to. Newspapers was something probably the older generation spent more time with. It seems that the internet and technology in general is a much more significant piece of the story this time around.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and Morley can speak to it in more detail, but I think that is definitely true. This is a generation that really understands not simply the internet, but even more specifically the social networking aspects of the internet, using that particular type of technology, almost to the exclusion of in many instances, of older generations.
The second part of that is it seems that technology is moving so fast that we're going to see some very important new developments well
Well, yeah. So it's actually an every 40-year phenomenon. We didn't talk about television and boomers, but that was, in an idealist era, it drove that kind of thing. The radio and television are both broadcast top-down, centrally controlled, limited bandwidth technologies, and as such, they reinforce the authority and ability of elites to control a discussion. The newspapers in Lincoln's days and the internet social networking in Obama's days do the opposite. They are very grassroots, people to people. I mean, yes, you did have to own a printing press, but it was the penny press. It was suddenly very cheap to be able to buy a newspaper and read it. So it was a hybrid of elite editorial decisions, but mass distribution. The internet eliminates even that piece of the ability of elites to influence public opinion. And, we see, obviously, newspapers shutting down or cutting back their coverage. You see Jay Leno taking over the 10 o'clock time slot on a major network, not just entertaining the president tonight, but all of that's a signal that the ability of people to watch and therefore provide advertising support for traditional media is fading away, and it will continue to fade at a very rapid clip in the next decade.
And just one last thing. The ability of using through the various portals on the internet of influence and of ways that individuals can access the internet is so much more complex than any of these other media. I've mentioned about the SIP index. The complexity of trying to measure internet usage compared to television or radio usage is so infinitesimally greater. And I'm not sure that SIP is doing it as well as it can be done, but it's a great first effort. But it's so much more complex because of that ability of ways of people getting in to the process compared to the Nielsen television ratings, for example, which are kind of relatively straightforward compared to trying to measure something online.
I'll just throw in one thought, and is that I talk a lot about the concept of the couch potato, which was the goal of marketing in the broadcast era was to think about this concept, right? It's going to be like those things you have to explain to your kids about what does it mean. Your job as a consumer was to sit on the couch and eat potato chips and change the channels and do nothing. It was not a participatory medium, and I think what's so interesting about this sort of confluence of need to get things done from a civically minded generation and a technology that is all about participation, right? I mean, I tell the story that there was a night I was watching a sporting event on Fox. This is the only time I watch Fox. Is that there were 3 consecutive commercials. One was for American Idol, which is a show you get to participate in. It's the most powerful show on television now. You get to determine the outcome of the event. The second was for a credit card that you could design on your own, and the third was for a car where you had the ability to design the car, right? So in 3 consecutive commercials, the brand was involving you in the choice of building the brand itself, and it was participatory, right? And getting to your question, this is the quantum leap. I mean, this is the huge paradigm shift from the broadcast era of political communications, which dominated everything we did here forever and ever. I mean, I think, and I predicted, and I was at an internet event recently, I got yelled at for saying what I'm about to say, is that for anyone who's in politics this cycle, get ready, because television as we know it will not exist by fall of 2010, right? Not fall of 2012, not fall of 2014, is that the broadcast television networks, which have been basically the receptacle for all of our money in politics for the last 40 years, essentially are going to be something else, by 18 months from now, based on current trend lines. They're admitting it themselves. And I think that, to your point, the velocity of change is increasing. I mean, when we were having these events 4 years ago, right after the last election, there was no Facebook and there was no YouTube, right? It's just kind of an amazing, or at least they weren't part of politics.
No, they weren't.
They weren't part of politics.
2005 is when they get
right.
created.
It wasn't part of politics anyway, right? So I think one of the interesting things is trying to imagine where we will be even 4 years from now in terms of the set of tools and how people are going to work. That innovation and staying ahead of the curve is become a prerequisite or a requirement for anybody involved in the political or advocacy business, which is one of the reasons why we have this affiliate called the New Politics Institute, which I would argue is one of the leading centers in the country really looking at how this media transformation is affecting advocacy and politics. A little plug for MPI, newpolitics.net. Next question, let me go to our online audience. We've gotten a lot of great questions, by the way. Thank you all back home. And this is from Nathan Naylor, an old friend. Question, does the advent of the computer, this is a great question, does the advent of the computer between the last leap in communications technology, radio, mean that Moore's law might now be a factor in the timing of the next leap, i.e. the 80-year cycle being reduced to 40, and it happening faster?
So it actually happens every 40 years anyway. I mean, there's two kinds of realignments. They happen every 40 years. Each one is driven by a new kind of communication technology, television in the 60s. Our feeling is that the next significant technological change will not take place and be fairly visible until 2040, 2050, so in the next 40, 50-year time frame. And it's not going to be a new version of the internet or the latest Twitter fad. It's be more about the age of singularity when biological and electronics meld in a chip inside your brain, and then you have a different politics altogether. I'll just say one last thing on the
conversation.
Yeah, just one last thing on the television piece. If you don't believe television's ending, the most popular commercial on the Super Bowl was the 30 Rock commercial, in which the head of the supposed television activities at NBC explains that they're really aliens from another planet here to suck out your brains and make you. Well, that's a very good takeoff on what couch potatoism was all about, right? But it's also the industry saying it's all over. It ain't going to work anymore. We can make fun of it.
Well, and in fact, that's an ad for an industry consortium to allow online viewing of television shows.
Exactly.
Right. I mean, that's what that ad was.
In answer also to that previous question, there is the second leg of these realignments too, and that's generational change.
Right.
And it may be that generations will become shorter in duration to some extent. Historically, at least according to Strauss and Howe, the earliest American generations were 27 or 28 years long. Now they're about 20. So that could shorten to some degree. But we still are going to have roughly that 20-year division where a generation is roughly 20 years, a birth generation is 20 years long. So I would still predict that the next realignment will be in 40 years, even with the technological change possible.
Let me go into the room, right? Is it the room's turn? Anybody here? Yes, sir, in the back.
Just in terms of governing after a realignment, what kinds of lessons do we take away from 1968 when you look at a president who, in retrospect, looks like he was ushering in a conservative age, but at the time was kind of governing more from the center and leaving behind a pretty liberal legacy?
Well, and we don't think the 68 analogy is a particularly useful one because it is a challenge of governing after an idealist realignment in which political institutions go out of favor, political parity is there and divisive, and so it's very difficult to govern. And so it kind of describes everything from Nixon through Clinton and even Bush in terms of trying to figure out how to govern. But in terms of the earlier civic realignments, the fundamental message is you have to have a very powerful vision. You have to enroll people in that vision, and you have to stick to it because most of the culture of the governing environment will be anti your ideas. Not just your party, not just the other party, but your party will be very suspicious and hesitant to change. And it's kind of the lesson of all change management consulting is that resistance comes immediately when you say, we got to change. Everybody says, why? And then they sit there and dare you to prove that we need to.
And I could also argue, too, that the 1968 realignment, or that particular idealist realignment, was not quite as complete in 68. It may have taken place in some stages, but I think we begin it at 68 partly because of the baby boomers coming of age, but partly because the basic Republican strategy of defending on social issues of the Southern strategy certainly was what Nixon ushered in, but maybe ideologically it might have occurred by around 1980, in the 1980 election with Ronald Reagan, and then the Republicans didn't take control of both elective branches until the 1990s. So it could have been a slower process, but I think the basic process did begin in 1968.
So a question from the internet from Chris. could you talk about the conventional wisdom that as people age, they become more conservative in their outlook, and how that relates to the current political preferences of millennials? Or is it that a generational viewpoint is relatively fixed, and that it's their position relative to successive less conservative generations that creates a perceived shift?
Chris's second statement is actually the correct one, that once a generation is put into existence, once its political viewpoint is formed, it generally holds that political viewpoint throughout the entirety of its life. The idea that somehow people start out as radical or liberal or on the left or however you want to define that, and then increasingly become conservative as they age is in fact not the case. People either start out as liberal or conservative, and they stay that way throughout the entirety of their lives.
They start out that way in the sense of their young adulthood decisions about how the world works.
Right.
And so one of the keys in the current history we're living through is that having made this decision in '08, if it's confirmed in the voter's mind in 2012, it's a lifetime.
Right. And so, but for another generation, in the early 1980s, the Generation X came into the electorate, liked Ronald Reagan, stuck with Ronald Reagan and Reagan-esque ideas pretty much throughout the entirety of their lives. So they started, but the important point is they started quote-unquote conservative, and they remained that way throughout the entirety of their lives. On the other hand, the last civic generation, the GI generation back in the 1930s, started as Roosevelt Democrats and were voting as Roosevelt Democrats. The only two generations in 2004 that gave John Kerry a majority support were the very first millennials who were voting and the very last GIs who were voting as they were going out of the political process.
Maybe we'll take one more. Yes, ma'am. Welcome.
This is actually kind of an appropriate follow-up. As the millennials grow, both in political influence, by voting, by becoming thought leaders, by becoming political leaders, and we're saying that their personalities are more collaborative and searching for win-win, I wonder what you think that means for bipartisanship and the divisiveness between the parties.
So President Obama called for a new tone in politics that was more of a civil discourse, and that's obviously something that millennials would relate to. They didn't like Sarah Palin. They thought she was rude. She had the highest degree of unpopularity long before everybody decided she was not ready for prime time, was among millennials because of the nasty things she said about community organizing, for instance. The world is not a community and it doesn't need an organizer. Most millennials say, no, actually it's the other way around. So just the tone is important. But in terms of partisanship, we talk in the book about something we call positive partisanship, which is the assertion of your party's political philosophy, which Lincoln and FDR were very good at, without being nasty about it, and by willing to listen to the other side. And so there was this great, subsequent to the book obviously, a great dialogue in one of the summits that the Obama administration did. I think it was the first one on fiscal sustainability. They had all the leaders together to talk about budgets and deficits and so forth. And the Republican was making the argument at the end that Obama ought to tell Pelosi to be more inclusive in her approach, right? And the president sort of remembered that there was a speaker and there was a president. There were two separate branches. We have a constitution. And he said, well, I'm not going to get too deep into congressional politics, but I do believe the Democrats have an obligation to be inclusive, except the other side, the minority side, has an obligation to be constructive. And that's a pretty good definition of civic era partisanship. We get to announce what we think because we won, and quote the president. You get to say what your ideas are, so long as your ideas are not blow it up, do nothing. If you have ideas, we'll listen to those. That's what we're going to call, quote, bipartisanship. And it is not going to be some kind of, third-way triangulation, split the baby, take some of their bad ideas, some of our good ideas, put them together. That's not civic era working together kind of attitudes from millennials. It's, we all believe this. Do you want to join the group? And if so, what can you contribute?
No, I think Morley said it pretty well.
I do think that Obama has to get a little bit better about saying, I love the sinner but hate the sin. Meaning that when I've studied FDR, one of the things I admired the most about him was that he ran against Herbert Hoover for 12 years. And in every speech that he ever gave, he started with evoking this sort of straw man of the conservatives who had ruined the country to remind us why it was important for us to not go back to a set of failed and bad ideas that did so much damage to the country. And I think actually Barack has got to get much tougher, not on the Republicans, but on failed, dangerous ideas that have done so much harm to the national interest. And finding that right balance, I think, is going to be hard. And frankly, it's, as Morley said, it's the inverse of bipartisanship, right? I mean, it's the opposite of bipartisanship. And it's why I think the concept of the third way is anachronistic. I mean, I think that, and I was an advocate in the 90s of people coming together to solve common problems. The prerequisite for that theory is that reasonable people can come together from both sides and sort of fix things. That assumes the other side is reasonable. And the problem the country has had, and this has been part of the problem the media has had, right, which is that the he said, she said media, is the Republican Party has been a destructive, unreasonable, dangerous force in American life for the last 8 years. That's not the way it's always been. We talked about Lincoln, right, who was probably our greatest president of our other party, but certainly someone who I have tremendous personal admiration for, right? It doesn't mean that it is always that way. But we have to be clear, I think, with calling out ideas and strategies and to not make allowances, I think, as Morley said, just because, right? Is that if they're good ideas, they get to come to the table. If they're constructive, and the challenge for the Republican Party, and I think you're seeing this, I mean, I've written a series of essays called The Long Road Back, right, is that I think the Republicans are more out of touch with the American people and more out of touch with American politics since they've been since the 1930s. I mean,
this polling data would suggest forever.
Yeah, and I think that part of the challenge we have, and part of Barack's challenge, is the way that he dealt with Eric Cantor that day also, where he said, hey, Eric, I know there's some day when we're going to agree on something. And he kind of made fun of Cantor for, frankly, being such an asshole, right? I mean, we should just have to say it, right? We have to be comfortable by saying that these guys suck. They've done incredible damage to the country. Barack is being wildly more respectful of them, I think, than they frankly deserve, given what the ditch that they've dug us all in. But that's his choice. But I think we've got to find language to condemn the sin while loving the sinner. And I think he's doing a better job, and frankly, I'm not very good at it either, but I mean, this is a hugely important task, because what is the worst possible outcome of the next few years is adopting, in order to get along and go along and to bring them along, is to accept bad ideas, like the AMT fix that happened in the stimulus, right, which was unnecessary, non-stimulative, and required, in order to get that thing through, completely inconsistent with everything that Barack was arguing. And I think this is going to become a really important thing to watch, I think, as we go forward, about what is the limit of what he's willing to accept, and when is he going to draw the line. And my instinct is that as he gets, he's only been there for 6 weeks, and as soon as he figures out where all the bathrooms are and everything else in the next few months, he's going to draw this line, I think, much tougher than he has in the early days, because the country requires him to do so. It is actually in the national interest of the country to do so, which is a very different kind of politics than we pursued in the 1990s.
Right. Let me just add one thing to kind of go along with that. We are in a different era. We are in an era of crisis. In the 1990s, really starting in the 1980s, people didn't like government. They didn't trust government. They thought government would only do bad things, essentially. So you wanted divided government, because that way nothing would happen, and we would keep on doing the same things. With the crisis situation we're in right now, people want government to act. They need governmental activity to resolve these crises, and I think the American public, we've seen it in the poll data that Morley showed, recognizes that the only way this can happen is to have partisanship of some degree, where one party controls both elected branches and accomplishes things. Yes, respectfully works as much as they can with the opposition party, but if the opposition party fails to work back, they've got to go ahead and they've got to resolve the problems that are facing the country.
We've got to wrap up. Do you guys closing thoughts, closing words? Buy the book?
Buy the book, yeah.
Just a quick final note, and first of all, buy the book. and it's a great one. And if you haven't had a chance, please do. And you can buy multiple copies as well and give them to your friends. Amazon's an amazing thing. And second of all, we have two, just quick announcement, we've got 2 events in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we'll be doing an event looking ahead as a preview of the Summit of the Americas, and it's a star-studded event with Senator Bob Menendez, the Foreign Minister of Panama, many ambassadors, Latin American ambassadors. Andres and Zaraya, our team, have done a phenomenal job at putting together what I think will be a don't-miss event. It will also be live webcast. It's from the new Visitors Center in the Capitol, so if you haven't been there yet, you get a chance to cut the lines a little bit and get through. And then also we'll be doing, the week after, an event looking ahead at the G20 Summit with Rob Shapiro and others, and look for that online. But thanks, everybody, very much. Thanks.